All righty. There we are, waving to myself so that I can see that this is all working. And from my text messages, the other Pastor Grant just waved back. So clearly we're on. All right. So we've got, welcome to Bible study, by the way. Glad that you're here this afternoon. Really looking forward to diving into it. And we're going to do a very interesting thing because we've got to start with Matthew chapter 1, right? No worries. Oh, there. We do. See, make that work. Always nice to know that it's working as necessary. So we start with Matthew chapter 1, and in our modern ways of storytelling, right? Nobody, and I mean nobody, would start the way Matthew starts. Because, I mean, what's the first chapter all about? Yeah, it's a genealogy. Yeah, exactly, Rosa. It's genealogy. Who begat who, and we start and we go through the whole thing, right? And you're thinking, well, wait a minute. We know for a fact that Matthew is a really good storyteller. I mean, he is. We're going to see that as we go through. Matthew does a great job of mixing story with teaching, right? It was kind of the pattern that he goes through as we talked about before. He knows how to make a narrative hum with interest and even intrigue, and we get to see that right away in the next chapter when he starts talking about the arrival of the Magi and all the rest. So we know that he's really good at weaving together the ongoing narrative with profound teaching, and we're thinking to ourselves, what in the world is Matthew thinking, right? Yeah, I mean, yeah, right. He would lose a lot. I mean, most of us go, well, I guess I'm not going to be reading the Gospel of Matthew today, right? Because and so but he did it for a reason. And so it really helps us in our understanding of Matthew the writer, but also Matthew the Gospel, to figure out why in the world he would make this decision. I mean, the first half of chapter 1, geez, I mean, it's pretty tough to grab anybody's attention when you're grinding through, what is it, 42 generations. 42. I mean, even that, I don't care how good of something is, if you're going through a laundry list of 42 anything, you've lost your audience, you've lost the plot. And I think we have to recognize that there's a reason that's more tactical than strategic or even narrative. And this is one of those things that it's always important to define our terms. And so we know what a narrative is, right? That's telling a story, all right? So what's the difference between strategy and tactics? Do you know? It's really important. Yeah. So think of strategy as your grand vision, right? What you want to get done. That's your strategic vision. Your strategic vision is we're going to get the church or anything to this point, right? So that's the strategy. That's the big ticket vision, right? Tactics are how you get there. How are you going to do it? Because and a lot of people could be good at strategy and they're lousy at tactics. Some people are really good at tactics, but they couldn't see the big picture if you paid them, right? Matthew makes a tactical decision that it's a how question. It's a how do we get people to where I want them to go, right, kind of thing. And so Matthew knows his audience. That's the first thing. He knows them very well. This is a group of Jewish folks who have become Christian through their belief in the risen Christ, right? So these are Jewish Christians, right? But as scholar Tom Long says, they are no longer in the synagogue, but they are not yet sure how to be church. Right? Well, they've just been kicked out or they just left in a fit, right? But they don't know what to do next or how to do it. And because they may even think that they want to be this thing, but they don't know how to get there. And so Matthew recognizes that they need to go through some steps to get to where whatever their grand vision might be. And so they need some, not only the strategic vision, but how to get there, right? And so what Matthew is clearly doing is he understands that they're trying to find ways to integrate Judaism into this new thing, Christianity, right? Although they don't call it that yet. They're the way. They're Jesus followers. The Christians in Antioch, which is in Syria, which is likely where Matthew's congregation is, the Christians in that area call themselves Nazarenes. Jesus of Nazareth, right? So they're Nazarenes. They are following the Nazarenes. So they're still trying to find their way. So you're trying to integrate Judaism into this new thing, and also vice versa. How do you integrate the story of Jesus, the notion of who Jesus is, what Jesus has done, what Jesus is calling us to do? Yeah, somebody's at the door. Oh, it's one of the guys who's looking for a bag of food. And so maybe one of the folks from Genesis Hope can give him a hand. Yeah, I think Michaela's going to give him a help. Ministry happens all the time, right? So this is, yep, we're on it. So thank you for those of you who are joining us on YouTube. This is the everyday occurrence, which is a good thing. It's an interesting thing because it's a matter of we talk about faith, but we also live it, right? This is us walking and chewing gum at the same time. All right, so yeah, go ahead. Yes, and thank you, Jackie. That sets it up very nicely. Yes, the genealogy is one of his tactics because, okay, if the big question is how do you integrate Judaism and whatever we're going to call this new tradition, right? This religion, Christianity, the way, Jesus followers, the Nazarenes. How do you integrate these two groups? How do you blend the two? What do you do with all of the stuff from the Hebrew scriptures, the patriarchs and the prophets and the priests and the law? I mean, what do you do with all of that history and the messianic expectations and all of that? And so what Matthew does, because he knows his audience really well, he starts drawing those communities together. And he does the thing that seems really counterproductive to us, but that is absolutely imperative because it touches on something really important, their connection to the generations past. Modern Americans are criminally disconnected from their own history. We're not good at teaching it. We're not good at sharing it. And this is where Matthew is doing what you would normally do if you went to a family reunion. And that is, you start to tell the stories about the previous generations. And you reach as far back as you can, because what people are looking for is where they are rooted, where they're grounded. One of the things that happens every now and then when we're sitting around the dinner table is that Madeline will say, "Tell me about my grandma, my mom," because she never got to meet her, right? Never got to meet her. "Well, tell me about your grandma," because she never got to meet her either. And so I share the stories, because one of the things that we did is that Madeline's, one of her middle names is my mom's maiden name. That's why she has two middle names. The other middle name, her name, Madeline, is the French variant of Magdalene, because we thought of Mary Magdalene when we thought of our daughter, right? But her second middle name is my mom's maiden name. Why? Because we wanted her to carry that history with her. And so she asked the questions. "Well, tell me about them." Well, that's what's going on in a genealogy. They don't see the first half of chapter 1. And again, remember, no chapters or verses back then. This is just text. They didn't see it something as they had to get through, but something that was a revelation, because it shows Jesus' connection to all of the past history of the people of Israel, going all the way back to before there was even a people of Israel. Because remember, Abraham's not the people of Israel. Abraham was a guy from present-day Iraq who was picked and sent. You know, he and Sarah weren't Israelites. They became Israelites, but they were Iraqis. Yeah, I mean, they will become the father and mother of a great nation, which means that the great nation didn't exist yet. And so Matthew's audience, because they're Jewish Christians, would see each of these names and they'll make, "Oh, wait a minute, we have stories to tell." And that's what they would do. So everyone, probably his congregation, is like, "Oh, wait." And then they would start to tell the stories of every single generation. And what is that doing? It's connecting past and present. It's connecting that community, and Jesus especially, with every single generation, going all the way back to before there was even a people of Israel. And so they didn't see this as dull. They didn't see this as, "Oh man, what a slog we got to get." It's a family story. It's a family history. It's telling the same thing over and over and over again. There's a prayer that we use just before a baptism. It's called the flood prayer, right? And it recalls God's mighty acts through water. During the Eucharistic prayer, before we get to the words of institution, right? In the night in which he was betrayed, our Lord Jesus took bread, broke it, and gave it to us. Before we get to that point, all Eucharistic prayers are in some ways telling the story of God's saving work through time, right? The one that I'm using right now is specifically written for the African American tradition, and so it speaks to the history of Black Americans going through all of the turmoil from enslavement to liberation, right? You take these times to tell the family story, to broaden the picture, to widen the focus so that we can see ourselves in everything that's happening. And so this genealogy isn't a slog for them. It's everything fills out the story. Everything's an opportunity, a moment of illumination and excitement. And they're like, whoa, wait a minute. We're connected. And so is Jesus. And you're like, oh, yes, that's exactly right. All of this and all of history then leads to Jesus. All of it. From Abraham all the way through. Now, Matthew's going to do some other things. He's going to keep, there's some marks of identification for Jesus. Because again, he's trying to tell them who Jesus is, what Jesus does, and then later on, what is our call? What call does Jesus extend to us? What does Jesus want us to do? Because the interesting thing is, if you think about it, if this is the way that it starts, Matthew ends with Jesus saying to the disciples, go therefore and make disciples among all nations. And so that means we're a part of that story too, right? Because we're the disciples that were made by their work and the successive generations. So there are a couple of marks of identification for who Jesus is. And again, each one of these roots Jesus into the people of Israel and the long history of God's saving work. So one of the titles is, or identifiers is Messiah. Right? And we don't need to spend a lot of time on that one because we know that. We know that Messiah means anointed one, right? Which is usually reserved for kings, right? When we think of the anointing, we think of David and Solomon and all the rest. And that associates Jesus with kingly rule, but not just any king. When we're thinking about the Messiah, and especially in the first century Palestine and Israel, what they're thinking about is their ideal form of a king, right? Not just, because when they're thinking about Messiah, they don't want some of the old bad kings, right? They're just thinking about the good ones. They're thinking about, oh, what would be the perfect king, or what would be the best king that we could possibly get? And so, yeah, it's going to be somebody from the lineage of David because David was the first real king, right? And he was a good king. More or less, exactly right. I mean, because the more you dig into David, you're like, really? Was he? How good of a king was he? But he was definitely better than the guy before him. And a king is supposed to do a couple of things. Bring peace. Have wisdom, show righteousness, and bring prosperity to all of the people. And these are descriptions that come from Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And so the Messiah is this ideal king. And so what Matthew wants people thinking about, because he's going to reference kings in this list, is, oh, wait a minute, Jesus is in the line of kings. Then he's going to talk about Jesus as the son of David. Many times removed. And again, that's because David is the high water mark for kings. It's like when we say that a president is Lincoln-esque, right? They have taken on that level of giftedness or thoughtfulness or the gravitas or all the things that we really can't say about our president right now. Right? Nobody in any history book will ever say that this one happens to be particularly Lincoln-esque, right? But by saying son of David, they're saying, yeah, see, he's linked, connected. The prophets had promised that the Messiah would come from a branch of David. And so anybody is going to say, well, of course Jesus is connected, right? And there's probably a thought in your mind at this point, and you're saying, but, just hold on to that one. Hold on. I know there's a but coming, because you're thinking, but I get it. We're still going, because we're going to come back to it, because everybody's got that same question. Wait a minute. Yeah, we'll get there. The other one is son of Abraham. This is a title, and of course, why? Because Abraham's the pioneer of the faith, right? And a great nation has been made by Abraham, of Abraham and Sarah, right? That has happened. So the thing you're thinking though right now is that yeah, exactly. Yes, you can, yeah, and so being the son of Abraham is not a complex thing, and it's pretty inclusive. Pretty much that's everybody, which is again, there's a point that Matthew is making in all of this. The other thing you're thinking is that if you look at it, there are 42 generations, but there's three groups of 14 generations, and you're starting to think it feels a little too neat and tidy, right? It just feels like he's lining them up just so that he can knock them down. And of course, the response to that is of course that's what he's doing. Matthew very likely knows that this feels all too neat and tidy and pat, and that even the people excited about reading about all this are like, it feels too convenient. Well, but there's a difference, and this is one of those differences that I've highlighted in the past in different Bible studies. Some writers are going to be very, very, very concerned about factual accuracy, right? Some writers are going to be far more interested in the truth. And factual accuracy and the truth may not always be the same thing. It's kind of like the days of creation, right? What happened on each of the days? Is the story of creation factually accurate? Does it matter? Not really. It doesn't really matter. I know a lot of people, and I'm sure there are people who, if they were just wandering by and they clicked on YouTube and they come from a particularly biblically inerrant point of view, would be freaking out right now and I'd get all sorts of nasty comments saying, "What do you mean? That's not possible. Of course, this is the way it happened. It happened in 6 days," and all this kind of stuff. And all I can say is, who was there taking notes? Because if nobody was there, see, that's all the details. How long were the days? God's time is not our time. You can get yourself absolutely wrapped around the axle of factual accuracy. And all I can think is, why are we bothering with that, right? Because what's more important? Factually accurate, because we can't, and somebody says, well, it's inspired by the Holy Spirit. Well, sure, yes, that's fine. That doesn't mean that the Holy Spirit is going to give you a laundry list and say, I want to show you how this all happened, right? Because it's less important about the factual accuracy and more important about the deep truth, right? Because the deep truth of the creation story, the things that we really take away from it, right, is less about, okay, the birds and the bees were made this day, and the snakes and the frogs were made that day, and all that other kind of stuff, and that God made it, and he said that it was good. Those two things. That's the truth, right? The deep truth.
Fact is that the God who says that there's nothing else that can be done. The truth is, God can do all things.
Yeah, exactly. There are things that ultimately aren't going to make sense. Now, this is not to say if you want to dig and you want to do this legitimately and all of that kind of stuff, great, go for it. Just don't wrap yourself around the axle of it. Because by focusing on the minutia, you lose the big picture. And so in this particular case, should we just be focused that Matthew finds a great way to line everybody up in 42 generations to come up with Jesus? Or or is he maybe going for a more artistic expression and reaching for the truth of Jesus' connection to the whole history of God's saving work, right? Because here's the other point, and this is the best bit. You go through all of that, you go through all the generation, and you realize there's a whopper of a problem. Just a whopper, right? It's one of those, and that Matthew knows that this is a problem. What's the whopper of the problem? Whose line does Matthew trace everything back to, and who's the last person before Jesus is mentioned? What's that? Yeah, I mean, who begat Jesus in this long history? Joseph. But he didn't. He didn't. I mean, Joseph is not Jesus' biological dad, right? Mary is Jesus' biological mom, but notice, Mary is not the one that he traces the lineage through. That's not true, though, because there are actually 4 women in the lineage. Yep, and we're going to get to that. So hold on to that, Rosa, because that one's really important, too. What's that? Yes, that's a lot for stepfathers, and that's exactly right, because by telling the story of the birth of Jesus essentially through the lens of Joseph, it turns the story around a little bit, right? The rest of the chapter is the birth narrative, right? The rest of chapter 1 is the birth of Jesus, but seen through Joseph's eyes, right? All the action, as opposed to, say, Luke, right, which so much of it is Mary. And here it's Joseph, which is how Matthew essentially cleverly sidesteps the problem that, Joseph's not his biological dad. But the important bit about Joseph is that he's a righteous man, a good person. Because what is righteousness? Obeying God. That's what it means. To be righteous is to obey God. Someone not willing to go against what God has called Joseph to do. And how do we know that? Because the angel keeps visiting Joseph in a dream. Because here's Joseph, his betrothed, Mary, is pregnant, and he knows he's not the dad. And he's like, best thing to do, make this all disappear quietly. Dismiss her quietly. She's not shamed, everything's fine, I'm clear, everything's good. And then he gets a visit from the angel who says, don't do it. Now, at that moment, he would have a choice, right? Because Joseph is a good Jewish man, right? He's a righteous man. He keeps the commandments, he follows the law, he's a good Jew who follows the long history and the heroes of the faith. He knows what his task is, and he knows what he can do by the law, right? And then there's the angel, because the law is pretty clear. The law gives him the out. The law says you can just divorce her quietly or dismiss her quietly, right? Everything's fine. Everything's fine. And then the angel comes and says, yeah, don't do that, right? Which means by going against the law that's available to him, he becomes Jesus' adoptive father, right? And thereby draws Jesus into the line of all of these generations. And it moves Joseph from the old law to the new law. Right? Old law is pretty clear about what you can do with someone who had a child out of wedlock. And in this case, what's that? Well, you could, but he's not going to do that because he's a good man. And But he's such a good man that being good, being righteous, obeying God supersedes following the law. Right? The angel encourages Joseph to not be afraid to take Mary as his wife and to name the child Jesus. And so righteousness is not simply about following the law, it's about obeying God. And so if God says one thing and the law gives you permission to do the other, being righteous means listening to God. And that's what Joseph does. He moves from the old law to the new law. He moves from the old way of doing things to this way. And that's really very important, because what Joseph is doing and what the angel is doing is saying, yeah, you can be wedded to the law, but something new is happening. And so even in that first chapter, we're seeing the transition from Judaism alone to Judaism and this new thing, and starting to integrate those. Now, here's the best bit. That whole business, there are 4 women in the genealogy. 3 named, 1 backhandedly named. And so I want to do this real quick, because the 4 that are named, Tamar, is Aramaic. Not Jewish, not a Hebrew. Rahab, you may remember what her nationality was? Canaanite, right? She's from the land of Cana, or Canaan, right? Ruth, Moabite. And then the woman who is not named, but we know whose name it is. Who's the wife of Uriah? Bathsheba. She becomes a non-Israelite because she marries Uriah, who is Hittite. You're like, okay, fascinating, Pastor. That's very nice. It's a lovely little bit of information. So what? Well, even though Matthew is writing to a Jewish Christian congregation, right? These are all Jews who have become Christians with all of their connections to the people of Israel and the Torah and everything else. Matthew is saying that the Messiah, Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, and that's a term that Matthew uses, is for everybody. And so he includes Gentiles in that genealogy. That genealogy is not simply just Hebrews, not just simply Jewish people, but non-Jews as well. And so Matthew, and it's kind of clever, right? And it's hidden unless you start thinking about it, is saying Jesus is going to be connected to a much broader population than the Jews ever thought. Yeah.
So important, Peter, father of all was a Gentile.
Yes.
Abraham was a Gentile from the word
from the very first. But you know what a lot of people do? They stop thinking about Abraham as a Gentile, right? Because he's the father of the people of Israel. They tend to backdate that. They tend to grandfather him. Oh no, he's the first Jew. He wasn't.
Because his first son is.
Yes. Yeah.
And his first son and his third, fourth, and fifth sons are not Jewish.
Yeah. And so, but you see what people have a tendency to read backward into history and to rewrite people based on future knowledge. And so in this particular case, though, what Matthew is doing is making it explicit. It's kind of implicit with Abraham, but people tend to say, but he's the father of the nation of Israel, and so they tend to backdate that and call him an Israelite as well. He's not, but still that's how people see it. With these, you can't do that, right? I mean, Tamar is Aramaic. Rahab is a Canaanite. Ruth is a Moabite. Bathsheba is a little bit of a different story. But even though we get to paint her as a Hittite, right, because she married a Hittite, she left the community kind of thing, right? And so the whole business is this, she married out and therefore she's out, right? But what this means is that, but Jesus is connected to both Jews and Gentiles now, which means that Jesus is going to be for both Jews and Gentiles, right? And that some people may get at and some people may not, but this is expanding the scope, right? This is expanding who Jesus is for, right? And Matthew does that all within the first chapter, just like that. And this is why all of a sudden that genealogy and the first story about in the birth narrative in Matthew is so important. We never usually use the Matthew birth narrative in Christmas pageants or anything else like that, right? We don't do it because it's not traditional, right? And it's not as homespun. It's not as cute. Right. Not as easy for little kids to. You can't think of a play that automatically go. So a lot of this is Joseph sleeping and having visions, which is, probably not as exciting, probably not as cinematic as a lot of church Christmas plays. But it's really important because it shows that Joseph is a part of this larger story that Matthew is trying to say. Jews, Gentiles, everybody. And then he's going to lean into that because the first story that he tells after the birth narrative in chapter 2 is all about the Magi. Right? More foreigners. Exactly. That's exactly right. So we get into the story, the entrance of the Magi onto the scene. At this point now, Matthew is at full boil with his narrative. And the Magi, this is great. It's got everything. Strange new characters from the East, right? Likely is not Persia, right? If that's what we can probably figure out. There's intrigue, there's tension. There's a whole new addition to the understanding of the identity of Jesus. You've got a really good villain who comes on the scene in the shape of Herod. But what's really interesting is now because we're set up, because chapter 1 is like, you got to pay attention to everybody and you got to figure out what everybody means to the big story of who Jesus is. Because remember, hold that one in your back pocket. The identity of Jesus is fundamental to Matthew. Yeah. Because he represents change. Because he represents something bigger than just the people of Israel. Because we've just come out of chapter 1 and verse 2. And Jackie, that's an amazingly good question, right? So why is all of Jerusalem afraid? Because Jesus is going to be for a much broader audience, right? And remember, again, Matthew's community is a Jewish community that's probably been turfed out of their synagogue or they left because of their focus on Jesus. And so every now and then, Matthew's gospel is going to feel a little anti-Judaic, right? But it's not for the whole of Jewish people. It's just that He's really got an axe to grind about the people that turfed him out, or his people out, right? They're hurt. They they're bewildered by this. They don't know where they're going. And Matthew, not surprisingly, is a little miffed, right? And so if Herod is the easy bad guy, all right, he's the king of Israel at this time, thereabouts, or wants to be seen that way. Well, then the whole people of all of Jerusalem are the king's people, because that's where the king is. And so it's not so much their Jewishness that's the problem, it's the fact that they can't see who Jesus is, right? And that's anybody who has it, but it's really specifically focused on that, because Matthew's already building this notion that Jesus is for the Jewish people and the Gentiles. And so the story of the Magi actually gives us another block in that, because the Magi function as symbols for Gentile Christians, right? Just like the Magi, Gentile Christians started without the benefit of Scripture as a source of God's revelation. They didn't have the Torah, right? They're from outside of that tradition. It reveals that the community of believers was going to grow beyond the Jewish community. And so the Magi represent Gentile Christians, you know, and so it gives the Gentile Christians, oh, wait, we're a part of this story too. But that's what's going to make people afraid, because up until this time, there's been a very special relationship between the people of Israel and God, right? It's you and us. It's us and, you know, you and me, guy. We're in this together. We're going to fight, you know, against everybody. Yeah, you know, and if it's not, you know, if it's not way back to the Assyrians, then it was the Babylonians, and then it's the Persians, and now it's the Romans. It's always us against the world, right? And the only us against everybody. And now what Matthew is saying is that, well, but God is expanding that story. And if you tell somebody who's been in, say, a clique, we're going to add anybody who wants to join, or there's a club that's been exclusive for hundreds of years, and now we're going to open the doors to everybody, the people sitting at the tables in the club are going to be really upset. You know, what do you mean you're going to let... Yeah, right. You know, yeah, right. But that's the problem, is that when it's been us against them, and now you're saying it's just us, we're like, oh, no, it hasn't. And so this is that tension, right? And so Matthew's building the notion, though, that it is for everybody. Because who gives Jesus, the infant king, true worship? 3 foreigners. I mean, and it's not even like they were close by foreigners. It's not like they were, you know, even Hittites or Moabites or Canaanites or even people just across the Sea of Galilee, right? The Samaritans, right? It's not even them. These guys are from God knows where. I mean, who let these people in, right? And they immediately bow down and pay homage to the Christ child. They offer their worship, right? They're true worshipers of the king. Herod, what's Herod's response? What does Herod tell the Magi? Find them so I can go worship them. And you're thinking, you don't mean to worship him at all. You just need to find out where he is so you can kill him. Your worship is death, right? Their worship is life. Yes. Just a really, this Herod is, yeah, just a really bad one. Well, no, I wouldn't say, yeah, he is a bad Jew, because if he was a good Jew, he wouldn't do what he does, right? Because his brain is less on his faith and more on his power and more on his control. He's far more concerned about his position in life than his relationship with God, right? It does sound familiar, especially people who say they're faithful believers. Well, like, well, if you're a faithful believer, you wouldn't be doing this stuff. That's just the way this is. You can't say, I'm a Christian, and then do the things that you're doing. And it's not just the one in charge, it's a whole bunch of other people. And it's a whole bunch of other people supporting, They get upset when you actually read scripture to them. They feel like that's an attack. And Matthew would say, I get what you're feeling. I know exactly what you're talking about. Because when he points out that Jesus is the Messiah expected, they're like, no, he's not. He's like, he's exactly that. I'm just reading these scriptures. This is who we say we are waiting for. And look who's shown up. And they're like, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's like the people, well, I want to vote for somebody good, but not that person. It's like the people who say, oh, I'm going to vote for a woman for president, right? But not that woman, right? She was the wrong color. She was a woman, right? She was, all those things. But and so, but what it shows you is that the people on the inside, they're less concerned about the faith than the position, right? Herod wants to be seen as king. And he's going to do whatever it takes to make sure that he keeps that title. But it means he's not faithful, and he's certainly not righteous. He does not obey God, right? And that's the difference between the Magi and Herod. And so the Magi, as representatives then of Gentile Christians, are like, wait a minute, just because we're not blood related doesn't mean that we're not related. We're not connected. And that's us too, right? This is really important for modern day Christians to grasp, is that we're connected because Jesus is the one who connects us. That's how it happens. That's how it works, right? That's where we become united to one another, is because what Jesus has done, not because of what we've done. And then the story continues, and it's just kind of gliding through some of these. So the Magi become worshipers, Herod pretends, and Herod has a game afoot, right? Well, I'm going to find out from the Magi what I need to find out, and then we're going to take care of all of this nonsense after they're off the scene, right? And of course, God's like, yeah, it's not going to happen. And once again, and this is the connection, what does he do? Warns Joseph in a dream, right? So it's not Mary who finds out that they got to go. It's Joseph, because again, he's reinforcing Joseph's role and Joseph's connection, right? And that means the whole thing, right? And so now what we're seeing is that, okay, so they skedaddle down to Egypt, right? They're safe, they're out of harm's way, and the hope is that Herod then repents, which Herod completely does not. And this is one of those things that's really important. God doesn't make Herod kill all those kids. Herod makes himself do that. Herod makes that. He has agency. In the Jewish tradition, everybody has free will, right? You know the good, you know the bad. It's up to you. You're not a marionette on God's strings, right? You're going to do what you do. And what Herod does is reveals that he's got absolutely no claim to become the true king of Israel, because no king would do what he just did. And so he absolutely cuts himself off at the knees because he can't see beyond his own desire for power. Yeah, yeah.
But the key part, when I read it again and again,
Yeah.
jumped at me this time, is the country of Egypt, oppression to refuge.
Yeah.
So startling that the country they flee from with Moses, who the kids got killed,
Yep.
to you going back to that place for refuge, was just like, wait a minute.
And again, what is Matthew doing? Matthew's connecting the fulfillment narratives of Hebrew scripture, right? And so he sends them back to Egypt specifically to get everybody thinking about, well, wait a minute. There was once a Joseph who escaped into Egypt, right? And so it connects all the way back to even before the Jews were enslaved in Egypt and to when they were in charge, right? Because Joseph gets sold into slavery by his brothers. Thanks. They get there. He can read dreams, and all of a sudden he rises in a position. Yeah, he becomes highly favored. Joseph and Joseph, the dreams and the dreams. What Matthew is doing is connecting Jesus and all of his. It's not the same story, and it's not going to follow the same exact path, but it makes those connections so people hear those echoes across the generations. Why? Because it's showing that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of that hope for expectation, right? That Jesus is the one that they have been waiting for, right? And he does that not only with that, but also when he references that when the innocents are slaughtered, it's Rachel is weeping for her children, right? And so it's connecting, always tying those pieces together, always showing you how all of this is knit together. And so then it's back to the story, right? And then it's Jesus and Joseph and the Holy Family going from Egypt to, where do they go? They go to the Sea of Galilee, to Nazareth, right? And this is where it's really interesting, because you're like, well, why Nazareth? I mean, Nazareth is never mentioned before, really. I mean, it's a middle of the nowhere. I mean, it's just, it's a blip, right? But it's in the Galilee of the Gentiles, is what they call it in Isaiah, because it was a land that was essentially run long ago by the Assyrians. They were under occupation for a while during Isaiah's time as a prophet, early stages, right? And now, well, they're under occupation again, only this time it's Rome. And even though Jesus and the Holy Family now live in what would be, even then, the heart of the Jewish state, historically it was seen as a place of Gentiles. And right across the Sea of Galilee, of course, are Gentiles. And so Jesus will come to benefit the Gentiles as well as the Jewish people, right? And again, all the time, Matthew is taking his deep knowledge of the history of the people of Israel and wrapping Jesus' story into that deep history, into that deep knowledge. Why? So that we can see that Matthew is sinking deep roots into both the Jewish community and into the Gentile community. But that there is this movement that if some of the Jewish people aren't going to, follow, okay, but God's got a bigger picture in mind. It's the Jews and the Gentiles. And so Matthew keeps opening this up. And so these whole first chapters, right, are finding a way to make that move and to make sure by the time we get done with the birth narrative and the flight to Egypt and Jesus and the Holy Family settling in Nazareth, we already know what Matthew's up to, right? He's been up to it in those first 3 chapters. And that's really important because it sets the stage for everything else. If you think about it, it's like the first 3.5 chapters are prologue, right? Matthew's just setting the stage. Matthew's just trying to get everybody to know that we're all on the same path, that We know our history. We know what's going on. We know how Jesus is connected to all of this. We know how we're connected to all of this. Okay, now let's go. And so I think, yep, I'm going to leave it right there for today. It's just before we get to John the Baptist. But I think before we get to John the Baptist, this is a really good place to go, okay, that's a lot. And it is, right? And Matthew knows that. But you can see the stage is now set. Now, the rest of the narrative just surges forward. Because now, what we're going to get from chapter 4 on is the 3 years of Jesus' public ministry. From here to the end, right? It's going to be this sprint. So next week, we'll talk about John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus and the temptation in the wilderness, and then right into Jesus' first work as the first public ministry, which happens to be the Sermon on the Mount. So we've got, there's some heavy lifting to do next week. So I'm not actually sure the verses. So read from around the story of John the Baptist and then read the Sermon on the Mount for next week. That will give us more than enough to get going on. And in fact, in the gospel this week in our text, we get the first part of, we get parts of the Beatitudes, right? But knowing what we know gives us an ability then to launch into Jesus' teachings with an understanding, okay, this is going to be different. And we've got to pay attention then to the details. Because I think one of the things that's going to really help us as we move forward is that we have to, because so many people skip the genealogy, we don't know it as well, and that's why it's really important to spend some time with it. Everything else, we're like, oh, I know that. I don't need to reread that. Yes, you do. Because the details matter, right? Because the story matters, because the teachings matter. And so Matthew wants us to pay attention, and so we're going to pay attention. And then we're going to go from there. How's that sound? Awesome. It's great stuff. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, to join us online who will pick this up later. We will be back here next Wednesday at 12:15, and we're going to jump right back in. There is so much to do, and it's so much fun, and I'm looking forward to it. So thank you, everybody. See you next week.
So Pastor, another thing that these young ladies were saying that they didn't understand, oh no, how can Jesus be